Reese, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am so excited that you are here, and I hope that you are having an absolutely fantastic morning, afternoon, or night, whatever it is for you when this video finally reaches you. Now, let me just begin this video by saying I have had a very eventful past 24 hours and am well aware that the video that I had hoped to have had up has yet to have been posted. But I do want to let you guys know that all of that is being completely resolved as we speak, and that video will be coming very shortly. But today, we are going to be diving into 3 terrifying true graveyard stories. Now, this one is interesting for me because I kind of go back and forth as far as how I feel about graveyards. When I was a child, at the very end of the laneway that my dad lived on, there was a cemetery towards the right of it. And I remember myself and the other kids from the laneway would often walk past it and feel some type of way. I actually remember specifically, I'm not sure where it originated from. Let me know if this is something that's a thing or if we just kind of did this when I was growing up. But there was a point in my life where I would quite literally hold my breath when walking past or driving past cemeteries, to the point sometimes where I'm like, ooh, are we almost past it? Or my dad would hit a red light next to it and I'd be like, I gotta go. And he'd be like, just breathe, Hailey. Because we were told, or at least I was told, that if you were breathing by the cemetery, the spirits would realize that you were alive and they would come for you. But why I go back and forth is not because I think you shouldn't breathe near cemeteries. I obviously outgrew that thought, but because cemeteries themselves to me don't particularly or consistently harbor the spirits of those who are buried there or who have been laid to rest on the property. And the reason for this is because if you think about it, if I were to pass right now and be buried in a cemetery, I wouldn't want to spend my time there in the cemetery when I could be with my family in their homes or, you know, places in the world. And just, there's so much more to our souls when we cross on than hanging out in a cemetery the entire time. Now, does that mean that your loved ones aren't there? Absolutely not. I believe that if I were to go visit a loved one in a cemetery, they would most likely be there with me while I'm visiting and see that I'm honoring them and see that I'm visiting them. But do I feel that I would need to go to the cemetery in order to talk to or see them? I personally do not. Now, the reason I say I go back and forth though is because I have spoken to many professionals in the paranormal realm, and many of them, and myself included, believe that a lot of the darkness that comes from cemeteries, the terrifying experiences and the hauntings, are often caused by what is conjured up in cemeteries. Why is this? Well, plenty of people will go to cemeteries for that spook factor. We look at Hollywood, we look at spooky stories. A lot of them revolve around cemeteries and graveyards and the spooky factor of that. So plenty of people, especially around Halloween time, will go to cemeteries or try to conjure things up, play Ouija boards in cemeteries, which you're not supposed to do. And so to say that cemeteries are not haunted, I cannot say. But to assume that every single tombstone is representative of a spirit that is there, can't always say. In fact, Lana has mentioned to me that she doesn't normally get much from cemeteries. But with all of that being said, today we're going to dive into the 3 true stories of those who have had some pretty terrifying encounters within the cemeteries. And I would absolutely love to know throughout today's video what you guys think of these encounters and if you yourself have had any in a cemetery. But without further ado, sit back, relax, maybe turn a light on, because it's about to get creepy. So this experience begins with a man who often passed by a specific cemetery on his walk to and from work. Now, he was never somebody who feared cemeteries. In fact, he didn't pay them much mind, stating that his family believed in cremation over burials, and so he'd never really even spent much time in a cemetery to begin with. His loved ones were up on the shelf on display in the living room. Now, one particular night, he was walking home late, unusually late for him. Typically, his shift ended in the early evening when it's just starting to become nighttime. He often didn't walk home in the dark, but on this night, he had stayed extra late at work and was walking home in the dark. Now, halfway home, as I'm sure most spooky stories go, there was a storm that started coming in, and he could hear it in the distance making its way towards where he was. So he started to walk a little bit quicker, trying to beat what he thought was inevitably rain. Now, as he's passing by the cemetery, he goes on to describe that the cemetery was a particularly large cemetery. It was quite a walk past the cemetery, even explaining that of his walk home, about a third of it was walking next to the cemetery. Again, he's walking as fast as possible, trying to get home before this storm comes in, when he hears the voice of a little girl coming from to the side of him, but behind him. And this little girl is calling out for her mommy and calling out for help. Now the man starts looking around trying to see where this child is, because it seemed as though the child was in some sort of distress. And that's when he sees peeking around a tree in the cemetery a little girl crying, calling out for her mommy and saying, "Can somebody help me?" Now when this man turns to look at the girl, she sees him right away and starts walking over towards him. Now the very first thing that he noticed as she was coming towards him was that her steps were almost like a glide. She was almost gliding towards him rather than walking, although her feet seemed to be touching the ground. He said the little girl started walking towards him until there was about 2 feet between her and the fence that was between the two of them. He proceeds to ask her if she's okay, and she just continues to repeat that she's looking for her mommy and she needs help to find her. He starts asking her when she last saw her mother, to which she gets confused and tells him she doesn't know, but she knows she's here somewhere and she needs to find her. He asks her what her name is and how old she is, and she goes on to say that her name is Bella and that she is 5 years old. At this point, he tells Bella, "Hang tight, I'm gonna call somebody to help us," and he proceeds to take his cell phone out and call the police to come and see what's going on. The police start asking for a description of the girl, and as he turns to look back, he sees her walking towards the end of the first row there of the cemetery tombstones. He starts calling out to her saying, "Bella, Bella, come back, or you need to come here," but she just keeps walking. He said that she disappeared behind another tree towards the very end of the row, and the officers tell him to go towards her and find her. Now the fence between him and the cemetery was rather high, so he had to walk around towards where the entrance of the cemetery was to get inside and go towards Bella. At this point, he sees that there is nobody in sight in the cemetery. He doesn't see the little girl, he doesn't see anybody, but he stays on the phone, with the dispatcher, trying to figure out what's going on. Where this story takes a very eerie turn is when the police arrive shortly after he made the phone call to them. When the police got there, he begins to give a description of Bella, how old she said she was, that she was looking for her mom, and a brief description of what she was wearing. That was when the officers asked him how he had lost sight of her and which direction she had walked in. He followed the police over to the direction that he'd seen her walk in, and that was when they shined their flashlight on the final tombstone of that row for a little girl named Isabella, who had passed away at 5 years old. To this day, he is convinced that there is a little girl named Isabella who had passed away, whose spirit had been calling out for her mother and had come to him that day in the cemetery. This next story is absolutely bone-chilling, and it begins with a woman who bought a home next to a cemetery. The property next to her was a cemetery. Now, she wasn't terrified to move into this home solely because it was a very, very old cemetery. She felt as though if there were any spirits that had been there, their family members are probably with them now, and they're not likely to be lingering around the cemetery. Now, as the years went on, nothing happened with the cemetery. She would never see anything, and honestly, the fact that she lived next to a cemetery was kind of just blown over her head at this point, and she was just used to living there. Until one night, absolutely everything would change. Now, the window that was above her kitchen sink was the window that faced out towards the cemetery. Again, she'd lived there for so long now, there was no problems with the cemetery, no hauntings in her home, so it kind of went over her head, and she wasn't always watching the cemetery while she did the dishes. But on this day, as she's washing the dishes, she sees in like her upper vision what looks to be a shadow outside and some sort of light. She said that she looked up and looked out the window and saw a man, what she perceived to be a man based off of the build and the height, walking towards the back of the cemetery in a long black coat and a very creepy looking mask. She said that she saw this man walk towards a specific tombstone and start caressing it, walking around the tombstone strangely, sitting down, tilting his head, and acting very peculiar. At this point, she said she got a really bad feeling, and that was when the man turned his head towards her window of her kitchen and just what she assumed stared straight in and at her. Again, he was wearing some sort of a mask, so she couldn't see, but the way that he locked on seemed as though he was staring directly at her. At this point, she went to go and grab her cell phone to call the police, and when she returned to the window before calling, the man was nowhere in sight. The entire night, she felt sick to her stomach and kept having dreams of this man. She couldn't shake it. So the following day, she decided to walk over to the tombstone to see if she could see anything around there, as nobody really visited this cemetery, and the fact he was in this long coat and this mask gave her a strange feeling. She walked up to the tombstone and read the name of a woman who had passed away a very long time ago. But for the days following, she couldn't shake this feeling of this woman and what she had seen. So she decided to go down to the public library and see if she could pull some bits of history or articles to see who this woman was and who may have been visiting her dressed so strange. What she would find out was absolutely chilling. She would find out that this young woman was killed and that the suspect was never found, but that there was a witness who claimed he was in a long black coat and a mask. So now she wonders, could it have been somebody replicating this, somebody who may be obsessed with the unsolved case or had heard about it and thought it would be funny to go and do this, or I don't know. Or did she see the spirit of the killer, and what was it doing at the tombstone? I know that one's short, but it really creeps me out because there's so many different theories as to what could have happened. So please let me know what you guys think. But either way, that would scare the daylights out of me. And this last one is a recent one that is still ongoing, and I'm very curious, as per usual, to hear what you guys think of this particular encounter. So a family moved into a farmhouse that was their absolute dream farmhouse. It was built historically but had been restored in a lot of ways. It sat on a large, beautiful property, and it was just everything that this family could have ever wanted. They felt as though there was so much property for them that there was far more exploring to do than they could do within even the first couple of months of living there. So they had moved there in the spring, and by fall/winter, they weren't even able to see all of their property and all the different places that were on their property before winter had hit. So when the following spring hit and they'd lived there up until then, they decided that they wanted to explore and see what the property had in store for them. They had little creeks running through the forest around. There was just so much wildlife and incredible things to see on their property. But one of the days, as I'm sure you could assume by today's video, they would wind up finding what appeared to be a family cemetery on the property. It was actually towards the right back corner of their property, right before the forestry line. Now, there wasn't too many tombstones. There was only a couple of tombstones, and a couple of them were also pretty broken down. You could tell that these were old tombstones, but the family decided, out of respect for those who had lived there prior, to not touch them, to not move them, and to clean it up and honor them. So they decided to kind of fix it up and make it look as presentable as possible in honor of whomever the family was that had lived there and had buried their loved ones there. By the end of this past summer though, something very unsettling would happen to this family. All of the kids had gone to bed, including the wife, and the father was downstairs watching TV and having a beer when he noticed what looked like a fire in their backyard and people walking in circles around what seemed to be the cemetery section of their yard. At this point, he was really uncomfortable and unsettled because they didn't have any close by neighbors, they didn't know anybody, and there was just no reason for anyone to be on their property, let alone setting fires and walking all around. So he decided to bring the family dog and grab a flashlight and go out there and see who was out there. That was when he saw 6 people performing some sort of ritual at the cemetery. He asked them who they were and none of them would speak to him. He said all that they would do was smile at each other and stare at him and look at him in a way that he said was so unhuman-like. He said that he told them they needed to go. Who were they? How did they know about this? And why were they there? But again, they never answered. They just smiled at him and kept giggling amongst themselves. At this point, the dog begins to growl and the fur stands up on the dog, but this seems to be amusing to them as well as they continue to sprinkle things into the fire and write things into the ground. The father is not having it and tells them they need to get the hell off his property or he's going to call the police and he will have them charged for trespassing. Again, they started giggling and they slowly put a couple more things into the fire as they smirked, staring at him, and walked away into the forest. Not even away, like off onto the road. He said that he watched them walk into the forest and then realized they were just walking further into his property as that was on their property. So he and the dog began to follow after them. But the moment that they went through the forest, out of the clearing, they couldn't see them anywhere. The following day though, he would wake up with weird symbols drawn onto the steps of their house and weird things left behind. He said that he didn't even want to describe these things because when he dug into them, he couldn't believe how dark they were. Now at first, he thought this was just people messing with him or young teenagers or adults who didn't like that he kicked them off of his property and now they're kind of retaliating and trying to scare him. But since then, he's been having sleep paralysis, feeling like he hears laughter and voices, seeing their sinister smiles in his face. And there's something about that back of the property now that doesn't feel right. But again, this is new, this is ongoing, and it seems like it's just the beginning. So I'm very curious to hear from you guys. What do you think they were doing? Who do you think they were? What do you think they should do? What do you think is gonna happen next? Well, you guys, those are the 3 true terrifying cemetery stories, graveyard stories. What do you guys think of graveyards? Do you think that they're peaceful? I know that there's people who find great peace in going to the cemetery. There are other people who just absolutely do not enjoy going to cemeteries. And then there's some who think it's it is what it is, it's a circle of life. And then those who think that there are things conjured up. So I'm definitely curious to see where you fall on that and what you think. But that is it for today's video. If you guys are new to my channel or you are just not yet subscribed but you enjoy my content, I would love it if you would go ahead and click that subscribe button. And please give this video a big thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Remember, my loves, do all things with kindness. And until tomorrow, I love you. Bye, guys.